Hi, everybody. Welcome to Along Those Lines. This is a podcast about electric cooperatives, the work they do, the challenges they face. I'm Scot Hoffman. I'm your host. Today, we're going to be talking about community development in rural areas. We know that for decades, rural towns in America have been struggling with declining populations, demographic changes that have hurt their downtown areas, and essentially small town America has been getting smaller. And there's a movement among community advocates that just might be able to turn this trend around. We're talking about a concept called placemaking. It's not a new concept, but it's under sort of a resurgence right now, and we're going to be focusing on that today. We have three strong voices on community development on the program today. We're going to start off with Jeffrey Connor. He's NRECA's Chief Operating Officer and a longtime proponent of community development going back to his days as a staffer on Capitol Hill. Jeffrey, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
We're talking about, in some cases, efforts to literally save these small town communities that have been struggling for decades. What are some of the macro trends that are impacting these communities so negatively?
Well, I think if you start to talk about communities in rural America, you're really looking at a diversity of communities. And some are doing really well and some are having a more difficult time. And it's always for different reasons. It's circumstantial, right? But you can't talk about rural America today without acknowledging a few basic demographic shifts in the population. One is that for the first decade in the history of our country, rural America is losing population. So far this decade, there are about 200,000 fewer people living in rural America than when the decade began. This is really the first time that we've seen rural places getting smaller.
Right.
And the other thing you have to look at is the average age of someone living in a rural space today is 46 years old, and in an urban area it's 36. So on balance, a rural community has people who are at advanced phases of their careers, maybe they're retired, and younger people populate the urban environment a little more densely.
Talk a little bit about how you see these trends. They're not only impacting communities, but they're impacting electric cooperatives as businesses. What's the long-term impact of these trends on co-ops?
Well, one of the things you see are fewer meters in service at co-ops, and that's certainly a trend that when it happens in a co-op, you start to worry about it being a leading indicator for the long-term health of the community.
Right.
Are there enough people? Is there enough economic activity to sustain that community or that place over a long period of time? And for our members, it's doubly concerning because we like to talk about the safe, reliable, affordable provision of electricity, and
Right.
that's the business that our members are in. But I think for the most part, it's more important that our members consider themselves to be in the quality of life business. So if they see that deterioration of quality of life happening in their community, more often than not, our members are the ones who are going to be able to act on what they're seeing. And that's where you look at projects around broadband or community involvement, philanthropy. You see our members take up that challenge and get involved in rural economic development.
Yeah, we're going to be talking to Zach Mannheimer. He's a big proponent of the concept of placemaking. Talk a little bit about the idea of placemaking and how that kind of folds into what co-ops can do.
Well, when I think of placemaking, I think to what happened in a lot of rural communities when a highway, for example, was built 10 miles outside of town and the main street in that community started to close up. Placemaking to me is about getting that spirit back into the community, that it has something unique to offer, and that the people there are connected and involved to building it and making it into a special place to be.
Right.
You know, it's one thing to go back and visit your grandparents at the holidays and be in that rural place because they're there and you're visiting. But
Right.
It's another thing to think, wow, there's something for me in that community, and I could live here. And I could live here because it's connected. I have opportunity. I can telecommute, stay at my job, connect with the university. There are telehealth opportunities. You can age in place. All those kinds of things. Placemaking is about making communities open and available for people at every stage of their lives.
Right. And the concept of placemaking is so unique to the individual community. It's not formulaic. You can't just throw it in there and hope it works. You have to know the community. Talk about how co-ops are really uniquely placed to do this kind of thing.
Co-ops are successful because they know the communities that they're serving.
Right.
And it's an example of, I think, of the way the model works, because here's a co-op that's really a community institution. And if you think about young people today who are looking for opportunities to get involved, that they live in a big city, they just don't have access to the kinds of participatory elements of being in the community and being part of guiding those institutions to do things they think are meaningful in the places where they live.
Right.
And the expression of that, it does come out in quality of life.
Let's talk about what NRECA is able to do at a national level to kind of help co-ops who see the need for this in the communities. What kind of stuff are we doing to help co-ops make inroads in reviving their communities?
Well, certainly making funding available for our members to be successful in the electric business as well as in other businesses like deploying broadband projects or partnering in broadband projects or bringing new technology with federal support or federal funding, community investment programs. The USDA Rural Development Program is certainly something that we advocate for, not just every time there's a farm bill, but every year when those budgets are released and those appropriation cycles begin and the government looks at the programs that are funding the important work that's going on in these communities. We're really successful because we do have this experience in politics as a membership, and electric cooperatives are so connected to the places where they're serving. It gives them a common point of view with the elected official who's also serving that community.
Yeah.
And in a lot of cases, it starts to promote this conversation between the two about, is what we're doing here in the best interests of the community? Are we forward thinking? Are we planning ahead?
That's great. Thanks, Jeffrey. Next up on the podcast, we have Zach Mannheimer. Zach is a rising star in the placemaking kind of sphere. Been working with small towns all over the Midwest and beyond to help them get back on their feet. He's working with a company called McClure, which is a design and build company that just started a placemaking division. We're going to play a short clip of a speech that Zach did at an NRECA conference earlier this year about creative placemaking.
When we look at a community, we like to look at, we don't say vacant buildings, we say available buildings. And we look at these buildings in downtown that need to be revitalized, either partially or totally. And what can we do in them? We ask the community what they need through visioning sessions. We figure out what's practical. We hear hundreds of ideas, we break them down into 5 or 10 that actually make sense both financially and practically. We take a building that needs to be revitalized. What can we do? Second story residential. First floor, restaurants, commercial revenue draws, live performance spaces, art galleries, grocery locker systems. We're working with 2 major grocery chains, so people don't have to drive 30, 40 minutes to buy groceries sometimes in rural areas. So, this is our process. We do visioning sessions, we create business plans, we write pro formas, we find somebody locally to own or operate it, we figure out how much money it's going to take on the capital side to do this, and we identify where those dollars are going to come. These are action plans, they're not studies. We don't want this to just sit on a shelf somewhere.
Zach also joined us on the podcast to expand on some of these ideas. Zach, welcome. Thanks for taking the time. I know you're a busy man.
Thanks for the opportunity. It's great to talk with you.
So you are a proponent of the concept of creative placemaking. And we talked with Jeffrey Connor here at NRECA about the general idea of placemaking. But tell us about creative placemaking. Is that a new concept?
It's new, I would say, to smaller communities, but it's been around for probably a little over a decade. It kind of started in Detroit to help fix Detroit from the major issues they were having. And the National Endowment for the Arts were the leaders behind creating the movement.
And what are some of the tenets of creative placemaking per se?
Typically, it involves heavy doses of arts and culture. And we believe heavily in how arts and culture can drive economic growth and population growth. However, we don't stop there. We go past that and get into many of the other issues that communities have. As an example, we can create great cultural centers and great public art and so forth, but if there's nowhere to live, there's no housing, that doesn't really matter.
Right.
So we take a holistic approach when it comes to creative placemaking.
That's great. And have you found that the smaller communities and towns that you have been working with, is the creative side, the artistic side, is that something that you can tap into easily?
Yes. Well, easily is relative, of course, but
Right.
There are artists everywhere. There are creatives and entrepreneurs everywhere. Sometimes you got to search for them a little bit. We work in towns as small as 80 people, so you got to dig a little sometimes, and often they tend to be more removed or not necessarily underground, but they've been making their art for a long time, but either not professionally or sometimes they just haven't told anybody about it.
Right. You spoke at the NRECA Connect conference in May, and one of the things you mentioned that struck me was the idea or the data that you have that shows that when people are thinking about moving to these small towns, the job availability is way down the list, 4th or 5th. So talk about that. What's going on there?
That's true. Mostly these are younger people, and when I say younger, I would say 35 and under. There's a lot of statistics that show that the millennial generation, especially in their early 20s, jobs are not first, second, or third typically on the list when they're considering where they're going to live. Quality of life and a good entrepreneurial and cultural community are the things that they're looking for. And typically, they're chasing much larger markets than rural communities where co-ops tend to be. But what's been happening over the last 2 to 3 decades are bigger cities on the coast like New York and Boston, Washington, and then, of course, San Francisco. Those cities oversaturated 30 years ago. And people have begun getting pushed out of them. And typically the first 3 worlds of groups to be pushed out because of economic purposes from these cities are artists, entrepreneurs, and immigrants. And those folks tend to be the people that help make communities unique.
Right.
And stats are showing that they're leaving these areas and going to other parts of the country. But over the last 15 years, it's been Minneapolis and Kansas City and Nashville and Austin and Denver. Today, those cities are oversaturated and they're being pushed out of those cities. And so now we're seeing sort of the third cities like Des Moines, Boise, Idaho, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Little Rock, Birmingham, Alabama. These are the places that are gaining population now. But because this trend is picking up in velocity, we believe by 2030, even those cities are going to be oversaturated. So that begs the question, where else are people going to go?
Right.
And we believe it's rural America.
Yeah, and that's sort of co-op territory almost to the T. So when you say oversaturated, tell me what you mean by that.
My definition of oversaturation is, can you be 25 and find an affordable apartment in downtown?
Okay.
And that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is from a job perspective. A lot of these people they're not moving to places because of jobs, of course. They're moving because many of them are working remotely. So do our rural communities have the infrastructure and the amenities that these folks are looking for? The ones that have them are the ones that are going to gain the population.
Right. You mentioned a handful of smaller towns that can expect to see the boom from this coastal migration. What can these towns, and by extension, electric cooperatives, do now to prepare for this influx?
So that's the work that we specifically do. When we come into communities, we help them figure out what they need to do. It's things like they want great cultural centers, they want live music venues, they want new restaurants downtown, breweries are very big,
Right.
They want great parks and recreation, and housing typically is number 1 on the list.
Yeah.
And every community we go to, it's housing and workforce development are the top 2 issues. We address those things, sort of a backwards approach, as opposed to trying to give incentives to companies to move to town to create jobs. They're not going to come no matter how much money you can give them. It depends if the talent is there. And the
Right.
talent will only be there if these amenities are there. So we begin there.
Right. And I know you've worked with electric cooperatives before. There are a lot of co-ops that are working on broadband projects and also very involved in trying to revitalize their communities because it's kind of their lifeblood as well. What have you found in your work with co-ops that they bring to the table in terms of getting a placemaking type project underway and kind of sustaining it?
So we always look for a co-op wherever we go to partner with in our work. Co-ops are, in my opinion, the best group in those communities because they're on the ground. They've been on the ground for a long time, and they understand that if this work is successful, it's going to equal more customers for them.
Right.
And so they are in touch with the community. They have those relationships already built. So we can learn a lot by speaking to not just the leadership in co-ops, but many different people that work for them.
What's your outlook at this point? Are you positive about the way things are going? Or are you kind of holding back a little to see how it goes?
I would say there's 2 levels of optimism and 1 of pessimism. The 2 optimistic views are, 1, these communities are going to gain people simply because they have to, because we're running out of space in urban areas and they're moving back to those areas. So that's a good thing, even though it's organic. The second optimistic approach is that these communities have recognized that they can no longer rest on their laurels. And it's the old economic model of trying to incentivize companies to come to town no longer works, specifically for rural communities. And we have to begin to incentivize people. And I would say the majority of communities that we talk with, they get that and they're ready to do that. And they're just looking for ways to do that, ways to create those incentives and where those dollars come from. That's the work that we do. The pessimistic approach comes from leadership. Something we've learned is it doesn't matter where you're located, how many people you have, or any amenities you might have. It doesn't matter how much money you have. Money is never the problem for these projects. Money can always be found. The problem is leadership. I'd say 50% of the communities we work with, leadership does not see the next 30 years. They don't have that vision. The other 50% do. And they're tremendous to work with. But we look for communities where leadership is strong, they have that vision. The other pieces of that puzzle we can figure out as we go along. Once we get into the actual work that we're trying to create, that's when we see the leadership really show their true colors. And sometimes they'll jump on board with these concepts and they're very aggressive and they say, yes, we're going to get this done. What do we need to do? Other times they question it and they don't execute on the concepts that are created. And that's normal.
So what's going on with breweries per se? That seems to be an anchor in all these developing towns. The breweries just seem to organically appear. Is that sustainable or is that just a trend?
Oddly, it's incredibly sustainable. In 2013, there were over 2,500 microbreweries across the country. Within 3 years, in 2016, the number doubled. Today, there's over 5,000. We promote breweries not just because drinking beer is fun,
Right,
but because of the entrepreneurial culture a brewery can bring to town. There is statistic after statistic that show when a brewery opens in your downtown, specifically in the downtown, not on the outskirts, but in the downtown, as close to on Main Street as you can get, the economic development around it grows dramatically and storefronts get filled and vibrancy is created. And there's lots of different ways to create breweries, but it is a terrific economic tool for smaller communities.
Zach, thanks so much for being on the program. And good luck with all these projects, and we'll catch up with you another time.
I look forward to it. Thanks for the opportunity. This was a great talk.
So next up, we have Norm Fandel. He's the Vice President of Business Development at Midland Power Cooperative in Jefferson. Norm has been in the community development game for almost 30 years now. He's been working in towns near Des Moines, Iowa, trying to help attract people back to these communities, and has been just a tireless advocate for community development throughout his career. Norm, welcome.
Good to be with you today, Scott.
So we're featuring Midland Power, your co-op, pretty prominently in a January cover story in RE Magazine. And we're talking about community development. Your co-op is involved in a project called Vision 2020 in your hometown of Jefferson. Tell us a little bit about that.
We developed the Vision 2020 after we completed our comprehensive plan 360, and we started that in 2017. And through that, we developed different visions of what we thought our community needed to have as amenities for relocating, labor and, retention as well. So basically Vision 2020 was kind of a timeline that we wanted to have some of these projects in place or in operation or moving forward. Vision 2020 was kind of changing the economic development idea of what we try to do in our community. It's more of a vision now with a shortage of housing and laborers for our current employers, and how we can kind of relocate or recruit and retain basically some of our residents to Jefferson, Greene County.
Talk about some of the amenities that you have in mind when you do these. You mentioned that housing is one key. What are some of the other things that you guys try and either make from scratch or improve so it's attractive to new residents?
One of the things that we have been trying to get accomplished was a bond referendum for a new high school. And we came across a company called Pillar Technologies, and they're a software development company located in 5 different locations throughout the U.S. We were able to court them back into Jefferson. We are going to be remodeling a downtown old building of about $1.7 million is the renovation tag on this facility. But what it did is it tied in a new high school with a career academy tied in with it. So through that, one of our goals, of course, was a new high school that we now have accomplished. We'll break ground in 2019. With that, one of our current is what we call our 3-block project. So it's going down to our community center, expanding that with the water park, taking what is a current middle school facility and turning that into an apartment complex. Mm-hmm. Alongside that, we're going to put in a splash park, and then the daycare resides there too, so it's to refurbish and enhance the daycare facility as well.
What is it about electric cooperatives that it would put them on that list of an organization that would be kind of key in getting one of these programs underway?
I think it's just the resources that the rural electric cooperatives can bring to the table. We're fortunate in Iowa that we've got a couple of groups. We've got our statewide development group. Also, we have the Iowa Area Development Group. So they are a development-based entity that we've created back in 1985 So when we're talking about the urban renewal plan and doing TIF, our area development group came up and did a presentation on how TIF can work. And also through that, with the filler project coming in, we were able to tap into USDA funds along with our local revolving loan fund.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're kind of going through that process, we have such a wide region of experts that we can kind of call on. And even through the NRECA or Touchstone Energy or NRECA, in those different values, there's just a great amount of knowledge that we can pull in and bring into certain targeted feature that we need to have within our community.
Right. Did your community have a period where they were actually chasing these smokestacks and trying to make that their development model before you kind of evolved to this current model?
We certainly did. We were in the process of getting our industrial parks up to speed, hitting trade shows and doing recruiting and promoting and trying to get businesses to move into our community. But as we watched the growth of our current employers and saw the needs that they were looking at and the inability for them to fill the positions and the labor that they needed for their next project, we came to the realization that we need to do something different. And how do we get people to relocate or at least stay within our region to fill those jobs?
Yeah.
That's why Comprehensive 360 came in to play once we developed and saw the needs of what that group developed for us. We developed Vision 2020 to implement and have a process of how we could complete those projects.
Yeah. Norm, you've been at this a while. Is there a new groundswell here? Is there good news on the horizon?
If you go around to a lot of the communities, there are a lot of meetings,
Mm-hmm.
And it's what's wrong in your community, and I think the 1 and 2 is either labor or housing,
Right.
but they're always 1 and 2. And I think there's a lot of people who are getting very creative in how to try and solve the housing market. Now, just because you build a house doesn't really mean you can get the people to move into the community. So that's the other step that you have to try and iron out.
Right.
And that's why we're trying to look at making the attraction that we have a little bit sweeter, I guess. My comments to people is that how do you take somebody from his hometown 100 miles away to bring him into Greene County to make $3 or $4 more an hour than what he is in his home community?
Right.
Most people would be satisfied with staying in their home community. So how do we get that person into Greene County and feel like he's got a better life?
Yeah. We talked to Jeffrey Connor, and he mentioned that efforts like this really need leaders. So the other folks who are a little nervous about getting in at least have a template to follow. What would be your advice to co-ops who are starting to get into these efforts to revitalize their communities?
Understand that it's not a process that can be done in a few months or even a year. It's a long-term process, and you have to have a passion to stay the course. Getting the young people involved and listen to them, to what their needs or wants may be, trying to get them involved. Certainly education on your leadership, whether you're county supervisors, the council people within your communities in your county, they really have to have the buy-in. I think you got to take the time to really educate them as to how this can happen and what the end results can be.
Yeah. So, Norm, I want to thank you for being on the podcast and taking the time to talk to us.
Certainly appreciate it. Thank you.
Jeffrey Connor had some additional thoughts about how cooperatives fit into this placemaking model.
For a small amount of money, for a small investment, you can get a lot of people involved in this conversation about what makes a specific community a quality place to be, what makes it unique, and where you can make a difference in promoting it as a livable community with a bright future. So if communities are willing to have that conversation, and electric cooperatives are great vehicles for convening that conversation and bringing elected officials together, bringing county officials together, bringing business leaders together, and bringing community members together, then I think you've got a great opportunity to focus that conversation and say, okay, here's what we can do. Here's what we think is going to make that difference. And then you've got the whole community behind whatever project it is you've chosen. And I think you've grown the appreciation for the co-op in the process.
Jeffrey, thanks so much for being on the podcast today.
It's a great subject, and thanks for having me on.
Well done. This is such an important issue, not only for America's small towns, but for the electric cooperatives that serve them as well. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. You can find links and more information on NRECA's website, electric.coop. Until next time, for Along Those Lines, I'm Scot Hoffman.